More new reveals about next year's version of 40k are coming out. Let's talk about the many changes to the secondary objectives. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy-focused 40k channel, where today we're talking about another bunch of new rules, kind of knowingly leaked by Games Workshop as they used them in their US Open exhibition final, the one where they streamed a whole load of games live with some of the best players around. In the video we're going to focus on the new changes to the secondaries, how we know the news, and then which ones look like they're going to be better or worse, and how it might even affect army construction. So, as I'm sure most people will be aware, secondary missions are the optional ones that you pick when you're playing 40k. You get up to 45 points for your primary objectives and up to 45 for secondaries. When 9th edition first came out, I think they had a few teething issues. Some of the specific ones just really punished knight players and psychers with some auto-include objectives that you'd almost always want to take against them, and some armies were very hard to score virtually anything against. I would say that in their last update they've already done quite a good job of reining in the auto picks and maybe making a few of the rubbish ones a bit better, though it appears that Games Workshop still thinks that there's room for improvement given all these changes. How we know about them is that they were used in that tournament, as we said. I'm going to guess that these will be the exact changes that go forward into Chapter Approved 2022, alongside the new changes to the primary objectives that we talked about last week, the ones where you score a little bit less for holding points, but each of the missions has a little twist with another mini objective to try and achieve. I guess we don't know for definite if these are set in stone. It depends whether or not they've already sent off Chapter Approved to be printed already. I think at least there's a good chance that these will be unchanged when that book releases. We heard about a whole bunch of the changes just in passing on the streams over the course of the events, but very helpfully a couple of the attendees from the Goonhammer team have decided to publish all of the changes to the secondaries in full in an article which I'll link down in the video description. I thoroughly recommend checking them out for any of you who haven't already. They're just an excellent all-round 40k tactics resource. In any case, let's get into the changes themselves, and most of the secondaries do remain the same as they were previously. Only 7 of them appear to have been changed, some of them in quite minor ways, some of them in quite impactful ones. First up is a change to engage on all fronts, which is perhaps one of my favourite. That's the one where you have to dispatch your units to the 4 quarters of the table. It's usually incredibly easy to get 2 points per turn, and if you can nose a unit into the 4th quarter, you can get 3. I believe it's one of the most commonly picked secondaries out of any of them. The Stranglehold is also very popular, the one where you need to knock enemies off objectives each turn. It does appear that engage on all fronts has been slightly nerfed though. Now there's only certain units that are actually going to be able to score those table quarters. Either you must have at least 3 models in the unit, or be a monster or vehicle unit. That means that a whole load of units are now just going to be ignored from an engage on all fronts. You can't just throw a character into a quarter and score that quarter. And if your squads get shot up so they only have a couple of people left, they're also not going to count. It is pretty weird that you could have, say, 5 characters and a couple of 2-man squads in one quarter and you'd still not get the points. So armies that like to use a lot of these are going to find engage a little bit harder. I think this goes alongside a change to retrieve Octarius data, where they're just trying to make really tiny little units not quite as good for hoovering up secondaries really efficiently, and actually have to commit some bigger squads towards doing them. Still though, it's not the worst change. I still think that this will be played, particularly for armies with lots of small fast-moving vehicles, or lots of 5-model squads. Next we have a change to Bring It Down. This is the Kill Things objective for targeting vehicles or monsters. Previously the rule was that for less than 11 wound models you got 1 victory point, less than 20 netted you 2, and 20 or more got you 3. Basically Bring It Down has got very slightly easier to achieve, particularly so for certain armies. The 1 victory point is now for 9 or less wounds. The 2 victory point one is going to be less than 16 wounds, so anywhere between 10 and 15, and now you get 3 victory points if you kill anything with 16 or more wounds. That's really quite a big change that will certainly punish certain types of play. In particular, transports tend to occupy the 10 wound slot, whether it's things like chimeras, rhinos, or Drakari raiders. Armies that include a contingent of those are all going to be giving up 2 victory points for every one of them killed, so it's going to make it a lot more worth taking against mechanised armies. I feel that that one might be a touch punishing for guard players. You're generally going to want a fair amount of vehicles anyway as damage dealers, and it's not so great that chimeras will be adding 2 victory points to that mix, making it even easier. The 3 victory point change is also interesting. It means that a lot of really big heavy vehicles and monsters will now give up a lot of victory points towards that goal. Maybe some of the most obvious ones that are now higher value are things like Orc Kill Rigs, Space Marine Repulsors, or Demon Primarchs like Magnus or Mortarion. Again, whether or not it's actually going to get taken will depend on the rest of the army. It actually looks like it could be a more popular choice against certain orc armies if you are spamming a bunch of buggies, a couple of planes, and maybe a couple of kill rigs. In any case, I think this will be taken a little bit more than it was previously, and it might even incentivize people to change up their army selections a little bit. Ideally, you don't want to be in the position where this is just an automatic 15 for your opponents, so it might encourage a little bit less spam of 10 wound vehicles perhaps. Next up we have a minor boost to no prisoners. This is the one for killing enemy models that aren't vehicles, monsters or characters, so quite good against extreme horde armies, but can be quite useful against elite multi-wound things too. Say if your opponent's gone very heavy on the Space Marines, or is fielding tons of swarms with a very high wound count. Currently you add up the wounds for the models killed and divide by 10, and that's how many victory points you score. Games Workshop have just decided to buff this in a fairly minor way, getting an extra 1 victory point if you kill 50 plus wounds worth of models, or an extra 2 victory points instead if you kill 100 plus wounds worth of models. I think this has basically been done just to make it a little bit more attractive, as often it felt just a bit borderline before. You could add up your opponent's army and know that you could get maybe 13 or 14 points if you killed literally everything, but often that isn't the case by the end of Battle Round 5. Certainly could be one to look at a bit more if your opponent does have a ton of wounds on the table, and again it's one of those secondaries that kind of punishes just spamming one thing, rather than fielding a bit more of a mix. Next up there's quite a few changes to the action related ones. The first one is a boost to deploy teleport homers. That's the one where your units have to do actions within 12 inches of the enemy deployment zone, but they do have to survive the entire enemy turn of retribution if the action is to be completed. If you manage to do it within 12 inches of the enemy drop zone, you get 2 victory points. If you manage to do it entirely within the enemy drop zone, then you get 4 victory points instead. In my experience, it's not very commonly taken, so it's not so bad that it gets a small boost here. Now if you manage to do this with a troops unit, the action will complete at the end of your turn rather than the end of the opponent's, so you can basically scoop up those victory points before your opponent has the chance to deny them. I would say that's a pretty significant buff to how often you can do this. If you're playing an army with lots of multiple small unit troops, say Drakari with loads of racks jumping out of raiders maybe, it seems like it might be quite hard for your opponent to stop you scoring at least 10 points from this, doing this on 5 turns of the game, with anything that you can actually get into your opponent's drop zone and do the action being a really nice bonus. It still perhaps seems a little bit niche to me, but if you've got loads of small units of chaff troops advancing up the board and they want to be getting towards the opponent, it might well be okay. Next, and the only renamed one, is called Retrieve Nachmund Data. This is the new version of Deploy Scramblers, which turned into Retrieve Octarius Data in the last update, and it makes me wonder whether or not the Nachmund name is a suggestion of where Games Workshop's next campaign is going to be set. Seeing as we just had the Octarius campaign, it seems that the Nachmund area is the pass through the Cicatrix Maledictum, the place where the Vigilus campaign was set in 8th edition, so it's perfectly possible we might be seeing a return to that war zone. In any case, Retrieve Octarius Data, or ROD as it was commonly known, that needed an infantry unit to do an action somewhere wholly within 6 inches within each quarter. If you manage to do it in all 4 quarters, you get 12 victory points, only 3 for 8, or only 2 for just 4. It was still really quite a popular secondary despite their new restrictions. Small units could reliably hoover up a whole ton of victory points. The new Nachmund Data secondary though has got significantly harder. It can now be done by characters and bikes as well. Previously it was just non-character infantry, but I think you're often not going to want to do it with those, seeing as you have a check at the end of the turn to see whether or not the actual action works. To do this, you roll a d6, and you have to roll equal or under the total models in the unit, troops getting a helpful -1 to this roll, so it's even easier for them. As you're only going to get 5 chances to attempt this action over the course of the game, even if you can get the units where they need to be, it means that any chance of failure whatsoever is really not a risk worth taking. So I think if you're actually planning to use this, you're going to want multiple units that are 6 or more in size, or troops units with 5 people in. I guess it's nice to have just the outside chance that you might unexpectedly do it with something like a single model character or something, but I'd see that more as a gamble if things go wrong, and not something that I'd try and do as part of the battle plan. I'd say this is one of the changes which I'm not sure whether I like or not yet. It means that the secondary really isn't going to be all that great for elite armies. Most of the time it was best just to have some very, very cheap units just run around doing these actions while the actual elites got stuck into the enemy. If you're having to tie up whole bunches of elite troops to do the objective over most of the game, then you're losing a lot more utility than say the armies that get very cheap 5 model troop slots, such as say Drakari Racks or Guard Scions. I feel like for those sort of armies the secondary is very much alive and well. but I think a lot of armies are going to be looking elsewhere, and there's going to be a bit less value to very cheap small units, say like trusty servitors that could do this for very little investment, or one model units like Tyrannid Lictors. It might be interesting to see if anyone starts to use this with bikers at all. You'd have to go around with models of 6 units to make it guaranteed, and if you did start to take casualties, then you'd rapidly make it less reliable. On the positive side though, they can move very, very fast, so it really shouldn't be as hard to get in the table quarters that you need to. I think for most people, that amount of bikers is just going to be too much investment. I guess we'll wait and see if anyone makes good use of it. Next up, on the actions front, we have Investigate Signal, which previously I would say was one of the worst, if not the worst secondary, as it was an infantry unit of yours that had to do the action in the centre of the board, but they couldn't do the action if there was an enemy unit within 6 inches of the centre. It meant to stop your secondary, all your opponent would have to do would be to just throw 1 unit into the middle of the board each turn, and then it'd be impossible to do this action. It's just really not a good secondary when there's that sort of level of easy counterplay. Now though, they've tweaked it to make it a lot more worthy of consideration. Now the action can be started if there are enemy units within 6 inches of the centre, but you still need to clear them at the end of the turn if the action is to succeed. This means that you can no longer stop this just by pinging 1 very cheap expendable unit into the middle each turn. The enemy is still going to be able to investigate that signal, provided they can just gun down your cheap unit. For certain armies, I think this is going to be a really powerful one. Anything with just a raw amount of might and defense that can hold the centre of the board against all comers. Maybe big blobs of Death Watch or Deathwing Terminators, perhaps. I guess it just depends on whether you think your opponent has anything that they can put into the centre of the board, and then you won't be able to kill despite your army's best efforts. Finally, for the secondary changes, we have Psychic Interrogation. This one's the Warpcraft one, where you basically have to do a psychic action that's Warp Charged 4, and do it within 24 inches of an enemy character, each time you complete it netting you 3 victory points. It was perhaps okay if you could spare a Psyker for most of a matchup, but maybe it did have the fairly easy counterplay that if your opponent could hide their characters and you couldn't see them, then you weren't going to be able to do this action. The change to this one is that it no longer requires line of sight, so that's no longer a play that your opponent can make, and to be honest, provided you do have a Psyker who can cast this each turn, it does sound like it's going to be relatively easy to pick up against certain armies, particularly ones that have aggressive characters that are going to be going forward every turn. It's still going to be a risky bet against armies with tons of Deny the Witch or other things to stop you casting, but against the right opponent, I think that this could be very powerful indeed. Quite nice to see the psychic ones get a bit of a boost. They don't often seem to see quite as much play as some of the others. In any case, that's largely it for the changes, though I must admit I was a little bit surprised at some of the ones that weren't changed. I was hoping that they might do something with the Assassinate one for multi-model character units. It just seems really punishing to say have Grimoldus give up 12 victory points, or Gaunt's Ghost for the Imperial Guard give up a crazy 15 victory points just for the one unit. That just seems a bit silly. And the Pierce the Veil Psychic secondary still seems unnecessarily bad. You need to get a Psyker all the way to the opponent's board edge, and then do a Psychic action several times with that same one. In lots of missions where the board edge isn't easy to access, that's going to be borderline undoable, and it feels like a reasonable one for them to rethink. Also, behind enemy lines, it still doesn't seem like it competes very well with either Engage or Stranglehold. Despite Engage being nerfed, I think it might still be a little bit behind. Overall though, I think that the changes that they've made largely seem like good ones. A lot of the secondaries that they do want to be used might be used a little bit more now, but I think it certainly will change up the way that people build lists a bit. Between the Octarius data and Engage being a bit different, units with just 1 or 2 models in just won't be able to do these anymore. So things like Tyrannid Lictors or tiny 2-model Ministorum units for the Sisters of Battle, I feel like they'll see a fair bit less play. I think the Bring It Down change might also make people reconsider certain very heavy vehicle armies. You really don't want to be giving away near maximum victory points, even if your opponent doesn't wipe out your army. Let me know what you think of the changes then down in the comments below, and let me know if I've missed or misunderstood anything. I'll post a pinned comment if I've got anything too badly wrong. If you've enjoyed the video and you'd like to keep up with Games Workshop's rules releases, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular 40k content coming. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, and you would like to help keep them coming, I would just like to mention quickly that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, and you can find that down in the video description below. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, including seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next for the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds interesting, or you'd just like to help support, the link's down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.